On March 21st, 1991, one of the oldest and largest redwoods in California crashed to the ground. People called the tree the Dyersville Giant, and it lies where it fell. When it stood, the tree was 362 feet tall, so that'd be the height of a 30-story building. Its diameter was 17 feet, its circumference was 52 feet. Experts estimate its weight at over 1 million pounds and its age at nearly 2,000 years. The redwoods crashed to the ground, moved the earth so much that it registered on a nearby seismograph. And one local who heard the impact from half a mile away said it sounded like a train wreck. In similar fashion, King Saul's death was momentous. His kingship came to a crashing wreck. The end of an era had come, and news of his death vibrated throughout Israel and Philistia. Did you bring a Bible with you today? We're going to drop anchor in 1 Samuel chapter 31. We'll eventually spend most of our time in 2 Samuel chapter 1, but we need to get a running start and give you a little bit of the backdrop here as we launch into our study. We're currently in a sermon series called A Heart Like His. It's a study in the life of David, and because David is the only man in the Bible who's designated to have a heart like God's, a man after God's own heart, it seems appropriate then to ask the question, exactly what kind of qualities characterize David's heart? That's the question that we've been trying to answer or respond to as we've moved through this study. Thus far, we've discovered that David had a faithful heart. On week 2, we learned he had a fearless heart. Last Sunday, we noted he had a forbearing heart. And today, we'll see that he had a feeling heart. It'd probably be more accurate to use a word like tender or sympathetic or compassionate, but none of those words begin with the letter F. And so we'll go with feeling instead. Should have received or picked up, if you wanted one, an outline as you moved into the service today. Feel free to fill in some blanks, and we've got some extra blanks for you to fill. There's bonus material, no extra charge for that today, but some extra blanks to fill in, as well as additional references as we move through this study. As I mentioned, I want to set the stage here this morning. As chapter 31 opens, Israel's engaged in a battle with their arch enemies, the Philistines. It's a battle that ends in disaster. King Saul's son, Jonathan, is killed along with his brothers. And as for Saul, we read this in verses 3 and 4. The fighting grew fierce around Saul. When the archers overtook him, they wounded him critically. Saul said to his armor bearer, "Draw your sword and run me through, or these uncircumcised fellows will come and run me through and abuse me." But his armor bearer was terrified and would not do it. And so Saul took his own sword and fell on it. A little bit further into the text, we'll pick it up at verse 8. The next day, when the Philistines came to strip the dead, they found Saul and his 3 sons fallen on Mount Gilboa. They cut off his head and stripped off his armor, and they sent messengers throughout the land of the Philistines to proclaim the news of the temple of their idols and among their people. They put his armor in the temple of the Ashtaroth and fastened his body to the wall of Bethshan. That's how 1 Samuel ends, with the deaths of Saul and Jonathan. In the Hebrew Bible, 1 and 2 Samuel are one book. They're not divided. Which makes sense because if you flip the page now to 2 Samuel chapter 1, you'll see there's this seamless transition to the storyline. 2 Samuel 1 begins with David hearing the news from an Amalekite soldier who'd been part of that battle. We'll pick it up at verse 6 of 2 Samuel chapter 1. This is his story. This is the story from the Amalekite soldier. "I happened to be on Mount Gilboa," the young man said, "and there was Saul leaning on a spear with the chariots and their drivers in hot pursuit. When he turned around and saw me, he called out to me and said, 'What can I do?' He asked me, 'Who are you?' An Amalekite answered. Then he said to me, stand here by me and kill me. I'm in the throes of death, but I'm still alive. So I stood beside him and killed him because I knew that after he'd fallen, he could not survive. And I took the crown that was on his head and the band on his arm, and I brought them here to my Lord. Because David had spent several years in Saul's court, he recognized that crown and bracelet. When David saw the jewelry, he knew Saul was dead. Now, scholars are divided as to whether this young man is telling the truth or not. Is he telling the truth about his involvement in this situation? His version doesn't match up with what we just read in 1 Samuel 31, does it? I believe he's lying. I think it's more likely that he came by and saw that Saul was dead. He stole the crown and bracelet from him, and then he embellished the account to make himself look like a hero. But his plan here backfires, doesn't it? The young man doesn't realize that David is convinced that the kingdom belonged to God. And if God places a king in authority, then only God can remove him. So the Amalekite expected to be exalted for killing David's enemy, only to learn that he was about to be executed for his story. It was always a hazardous occupation to be a messenger in the Old Testament. You weren't ever sure how the news would go over when you delivered it. All of us experience losses through our lives, don't we? Sometimes we lose our job. We can lose material possessions or our health. Sometimes we lose a relationship that's important to us because of a conflict or because somebody moves away. But the toughest losses of all are when a spouse, a family member, or a close friend passes away. Bereavement. It actually comes from the word reeve. And if you look it up in the dictionary, you'll find it means to take away by force, to plunder or rob. Death robs us, doesn't it? The grave plunders moments and memories not yet shared. Birthdays, vacations, leisurely walks, talks over coffee. Normal is no more and never will be again. Certainly the most agonizing pain of death is its earthly finality. Being deprived of the presence of somebody we love for the remainder of our lives is the most severe of all heartaches. Within our text today, the curtain's going to be pulled back, and we're going to have an intimate glimpse into David's heart and how he handled the grief of losing his best friend. So 6 principles on that outline today, and we're going to use the acrostic of grieve. So the first letter of each word in those points will spell out the word grieve for us this morning. Principle number 1, grant that a loss has occurred. What's the first thing that David does upon hearing this news? Well, if you look at verse 11, then David and all the men with him took hold of their clothes and tore them. They mourned and wept and fasted till evening for Saul and his son Jonathan, and for the army of the Lord, and for the nation of Israel, because they had fallen by the sword. Isn't that interesting? From a human perspective, this is not what you would expect. I mean, stop and think about it here for a second. David has been waiting in the wings for the past 10 to 15 years to become the king of Israel, and now his competition has been eliminated, right? I mean, you'd almost expect him to burst into a chorus of ding dong, the king is dead here, right? From a strictly personal standpoint, Saul's death was a ginormous advantage to David. But rather than focusing on how Saul's death was going to benefit him, David felt the need to express his grief. And he and his men did so by openly tearing their clothes and mourning and weeping and fasting for the rest of that day. Here's where a lot of us get in trouble right off the bat. One of the defense mechanisms that many of us have learned when dealing with a loss is either to deny the loss or to minimize its significance. We convince ourselves that the loss isn't real, or it's not really going to be that big of a deal. But the problem with that kind of reaction is that we short-circuit the grieving process. We need to acknowledge that yes, a significant loss has occurred. Well, how do we do that? Well, we can follow David's lead here, can't we? Tears are an appropriate expression of our anguish. We know in John chapter 11 that Jesus wept at the graveside of his friend Lazarus, even though he knew how the story would end and that Lazarus would emerge from that tomb. And yet Jesus wept. He still expressed sadness. If he could, then you can. Tears are a perfect response to deep loss. Time is another way to acknowledge our loss. Egyptians dress in black for 6 months. Some Muslims wear mourning clothes for a year. Orthodox Jews offer prayers for deceased parents every day for 11 months. It wasn't that long ago that rural Americans would wear black armbands for a period of several weeks. And today, you could make the case that we hurry our hurts. Grief takes time. Give yourself some. There's no standard schedule. Everyone will grieve at their own pace and in their own way. Tears, time, one more. We need to face our grief with truth. Are you angry with God? Tell him. Are you disappointed, frustrated with the Lord? It's okay to admit that. Are you weary of telling people that you feel fine when you don't? Tell the truth. Be honest. You know, the reality is we can't hide our feelings and thoughts from God, can we? He's already aware of them. And there are numerous examples throughout the Bible where people share their feelings openly with God. Now, that doesn't mean we're disrespectful, but we can be honest with him. He's big enough to handle it. Principle number 1, we grant that a loss has occurred. Principle number 2, refuse to dwell on past wounds. It's astounding that David is able to mourn here for Saul at all. I mean, after all, this is the guy who tried to kill him on at least 6 different occasions that we know of. He's been chasing him around the countryside for years. And yet, how does David respond to Saul's death? Look at it, verse 17. David took up this lament concerning Saul and his son Jonathan, and he ordered that the people of Judah be taught this lament of the bow. That's what the song is called, the bow. Notice, David took up this lament twice in that section, right? That's a word that has all but disappeared from our vocabulary. How often do you hear people talking about a lament these days? But in the Bible, the concept of lament was very important. In fact, about 70% of the Psalms, many of them written by David, are classified as laments. We have an entire book of the Bible written by the prophet Jeremiah known as Lamentations, right? It's filled with laments on what happened to Israel and God's people. So here, upon hearing the news of Saul's demise, David isn't interested in composing a tell-all memoir about the king and his faults and weaknesses. Instead, he pens a beautiful eulogy, which is the first record of a lament in the Bible. And in it, he doesn't trash Saul's legacy. No, he has nothing but good to say about the man who hated, humiliated, and hunted him. And since David ordered the people of Israel to be taught this lament, I guess the very least that we could do this morning is read down through it, right? Don't you think? Pick it up at verse 19. Your glory, O Israel, lies slain on your heights, Israel. How the mighty have fallen. Tell it not in Gath, proclaim it not in the streets of Ashkelon. Let the daughters of the Philistines be glad, lest the daughters of the uncircumcised rejoice. O mountains of Gilboa, may you have neither dew nor rain, nor fields that yield offerings of grain. For there the shield of the mighty was defiled, the shield of Saul no longer rubbed with oil. From the blood of the slain, from the flesh of the mighty, the bow of Jonathan did not turn back. The sword of Saul did not remain unsatisfied. Saul and Jonathan in life, they were loved and gracious, and in death they were not parted. They were swifter than eagles. They were stronger than lions. O daughters of Israel, weep for Saul, who clothed you in scarlet and finery, who adorned your garments with ornaments of gold. Lots there we could unpack this morning. But I want you to take special note of the language that David uses to describe Saul. He begins by calling him Israel's glory, doesn't he? And actually 4 times throughout this entire song, we didn't cover every one of them yet, but 4 times David calls Saul and Jonathan the mighty have fallen. He goes on to say that they were loved and gracious. They were swifter than eagles. They were stronger than lions. And that really is remarkable. And kind of goes back to where we were a week ago. If you were with us last Sunday, when we discovered that David had a forbearing heart, he refused to be consumed with bitterness. He knew how to let go of personal attacks and insults. And it's a great reminder to us that we live in a world filled with sinful human beings. Others are going to hurt us, sometimes unintentionally, and then other times very willfully. But we can't allow those hurts to consume us or poison our spirits. Grant that a loss occurred. Refuse to dwell on past wounds. Principle number 3, identify the blessings that I enjoyed. You know, I think part of the reason that David was able to let go of the pain that Saul had caused him is because he recognized that one of the greatest blessings in his life, his friendship with Jonathan, would have never happened had he not been associated with King Saul. Does that make sense? And that's where David's lament goes next, doesn't it? Verse 25, how the mighty have fallen in battle. Jonathan lies slain on your heights. I grieve for you, Jonathan, my brother. You were very dear to me. We didn't cover this early on, but in the day that David defeated Goliath, Jonathan pledged his loyalty. If you want to take a look later today or later this week, spend some time in 1 Samuel 18. After David had finished talking with Saul, this is immediately after the death of Goliath, Jonathan became one in spirit with David, and he loved him as himself. Now keep in mind that Jonathan was a skilled warrior. He was fighting Philistines while David was still feeding the sheep in the pasture. But Jonathan had every reason to despise David, and yet he didn't. He was gracious. How gracious? Well, look at verses 3 and 4. Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as himself. He took off the robe he was wearing and gave it to David along with his tunic, even his sword, his bow, and his belt. So Jonathan here effectively is crowning David as the next heir to the throne. He's recognizing David's going to be the next king. He was rightfully in line. Instead, he acknowledges David's going to be the next king. And then he protects David. When Jonathan learned of his father's plots to harm him, he not only informed his friend, in some cases, he hid him. And David found that astonishing. No jealousy, no animosity, just unconditional and caring love. They made a covenant between themselves that they would love each other until death. And now Jonathan was dead. And David felt the loss most keenly. I need to go on record here. We need to state it clearly. In the latter part of verse 26, David writes, your love for me, Jonathan, was wonderful, more wonderful than that of women. It's tragic, but this text has been hijacked by some to try to justify the sin of homosexuality. It is just a distortion of Scripture. It is downright blasphemous to even suggest that in this passage. David and Jonathan enjoyed a relationship that God had initiated by knitting their souls together. That's the language in the text, that God knit their souls together. And the word for love there is a hava in Hebrew, which really describes a love between family and friends. And so it differs from the word that's used for sexual love in the Old Testament, yada, to know an individual. It isn't even the right word to try to make that argument, to try to make that case. This was a one-of-a-kind, God-honoring bond that these men shared that was unlike any other relationship. When we experience a loss in our lives, one of the best ways to honor our loved one is to reflect back and remember the blessings that have come into our lives. Remember the blessings that came into our lives because God placed that individual in our life. We typically do that at funerals, don't we? And rightly so. When we go to a funeral, we hear people share the memories and the stories of that person's life and how they had a positive impact on those around them. That's a key part, that's a critical part of the grieving process. We grant a loss occurred. We refuse to dwell on past wounds. We identify the blessings that came as a result of that relationship. Principle number 4, we express our grief with others. I think it's critical to note here just how public David's expression of grief was. In fact, not only is he openly mourning, but he's inviting others to join him in that process. And David's men follow his lead. We've already noted by tearing their clothes, by weeping, by fasting. And then I also mentioned earlier that David orders that this lament be taught to the men of Judah, that it be written, that it be recorded in the book of Yashar. Now, don't go looking for the book of Yashar in your table of contents, the book in your Bible, okay? If you're trying to find it in your Bible, it's not there. There's one other reference to the book of Yashar in Joshua chapter 10, verse 13, but the reality is we don't have this historical record. Most scholars believe that it was really a summarization of Israel's victories, battles. And in this case, by writing it down in the book of Yashar, it would have made it easier for David's lament to be passed on to others. That was the goal here, right? That others would learn it, that they would recite it, that they would repeat it out loud together. In other words, this lament was communal and mandatory. Again, one of the mistakes that we often make when dealing with our losses is that we isolate ourselves and try to handle our grief on our own. But again, the evidence is that withdrawal is a very unhealthy way to work through that loss, that grief. In fact, there are many studies that indicate one of the most common effects of withdrawal becomes depression. And it seems to me that one of the reasons that God intends for lament to take place within the community of believers is so that we can have the kind of encouragement and support that we need in order to deal with our loss and to be able to go on. Mourning is something done best in community. Grieving is something that's done best with others. That's why we join together. That's for funerals and memorial services. You know, the saddest funerals that I've been a part of were not those deaths that were untimely and unexpected. As difficult and hard as those are, the saddest funerals that I've been a part of are those rare occasions where nobody's there. Or maybe just a handful of people to grieve for the deceased individual. We need a community around us when we mourn the loss of a loved one, don't we? The person who's died deserves family and friends to express the loss that their death has brought on the world and to acknowledge their contribution to the lives of others. But we can only reap the benefits of that kind of encouragement and help if we choose to experience our lament in community with others. So we grant, we refuse, we identify, we express. Principle number 5, we verify that God is at work in my pain. 3 times throughout this lament, if you read through the entire thing, 3 times you'll see this phrase, how the mighty have fallen. And it just seems to me that it's an expression that David, it's like he's astonished that this has occurred. He's marveling that this actually happened. It's an expression I think he's using to grapple with life's ultimate questions. He's contemplating the deaths of Jonathan and Saul from God's perspective and trying to fit it into the Almighty's eternal purpose. I appreciated Pastor Erwin Lutzer's words at this point. He wrote a book entitled Growing Through Conflict, and in that book he makes this statement. He says, our world is filled with grief. Some mourn the loss of a loved one, others the loss of a marriage or of good health. Millions grieve because of famine, earthquakes, or the devastation of disease. Ours is a world of sorrow. Grief itself is not all bad. In fact, if handled correctly, it can be God's way of preparing us to enter into a new phase of existence. Yet improperly handled, sorrow can be devastating. Some people become locked into the past and never make the transition to new challenges and relationships. Good grief should help us face our sorrow and clarify our values. What we believe determines how we grieve. When faced with death, it's only natural. It's to be expected. We struggle with that question, why, right? Why, God? Why did my loved one have to die? Why did this have to happen now? Death, pain, suffering, they all confront us with the mystery of God's ways. But I'm convinced from my understanding of the Bible that the question that God wants us to ask at that point is not so much why, but rather what or how. God, what do you want to do in my life as a result of this loss? God, how do you want to work in my life through this sequence of events? Do we genuinely believe in God's sovereignty, His goodness, His love for us? If so, then eventually we can also arrive at that point where we believe Romans 8:28. And we can say, and we know that in all things, yes, even the painful things, even the things I don't understand, in all things God works. And He does so for the good of those who love Him, for those who've been called according to His purpose. So we grant, refuse, identify, express, verify. One more. Principle number 6, we engage in life as soon as possible. Notice that 2 Samuel chapter 2, verse 1 begins with these words, in the course of time. Some things just take the course of time, don't they? David's son Solomon will later record these words in the book of Ecclesiastes, for everything there's a season, a time for every activity under heaven, a time to cry and a time to laugh, a time to grieve and a time to dance. Bad grief will not acknowledge that there is life after sorrow. Good grief comes to terms with the full impact of the loss, but it can also grasp that life must continue. As long as one is alive, life is to be lived. And so here in 2 Samuel chapter 1 and 2, we don't know exactly how long it took, but after an appropriate amount of time to grieve, David got on with his life and he began the process of becoming the next king of Israel. I don't have a chart that tells you how long to grieve before you get on with life after a loss. That time frame depends on a lot of variables. It depends on the magnitude of the loss. I know it takes a lot longer to move on with life after the death of a spouse than the loss of some material possession. But a healthy grieving process requires that there comes a point when I need to get on with my life after that loss. And I would just add this. Don't listen to those who with good intentions, will often try to suggest you should be over it by now. Don't listen to that advice. I like the way a chaplain friend, John Swanson, put it. He said, you don't have to move on. Instead, we go on. When a family member or friend dies, we go on, taking one step then another. But we don't move on. And as we go on, as we move forward, we'll remember what they thought about things, we'll respond to what they have done, and we will carry them with us. In the course of time, David inquired of the Lord. David asked God what his next move should be. And we'll pick up the story there next week. It's a familiar account to most of us, but I think it bears repeating today, and I think it fits well with our discussion this morning. Horatio Spafford was a successful attorney in Chicago. He was the father of 4 daughters, an active member of the Presbyterian Church, and a loyal friend and supporter of D.L. Moody. And then a series of calamities began, starting with the Great Chicago Fire of 1871, which wiped out the family's extensive real estate investments. When Moody left for Great Britain to do an evangelistic campaign, Spafford decided to lift the spirits of his family by taking them on a vacation to Europe. He planned to assist Moody in the revival meetings once they arrived there. But at the last minute, Spafford was detained by urgent business, and so he sent his wife and 4 daughters on ahead as scheduled, planning to join them very soon. Halfway across the Atlantic, their ship was struck by an English vessel, and as a result, it sank in 12 minutes. All 4 of the Spafford daughters were among the 226 who drowned. Mrs. Spafford was among the few who were miraculously saved. Horatio Spafford stood hour after hour on the deck of the ship, carrying him to rejoin his sorrowing wife. And when that ship passed the approximate place where his precious daughters had drowned, Spafford received the comfort from God that enabled him to write these words: "When peace like a river attendeth my way, when sorrows like sea billows roll, whatever my lot, thou hast taught me to say, it is well with my soul." We're going to sing that hymn as we wrap up our service this morning. Will you join me by getting on your feet?